This podcast is called Understanding and Addressing Systematic Variability. Systematic variability is a model or established pattern that exhibits predictable results. Previously, we looked at this image in which I sought to demonstrate how individual students are predictably variable, that where we tend to think of students as homogeneous, in fact, we recognize now that they are very different in terms of interest, in terms of styles, in terms of experience and background, in terms of a number of factors that affect their learning. Recognition that students are not homogeneous is important in understanding that we don't only need to vary our curriculum for the sake of those students who are identified as having disabilities or giftedness, but rather we need to recognize the systematic variability that all of our students bring to the classroom. To understand this better, let me start with a question. Generally speaking, ought a teacher teach Hamlet to fifth graders? Why or why not? Most people would say no, and in expressing why, they would say, for example, that students who are in fifth grade at that age simply do not have the capacity, the maturity, or the emotional range necessary to appreciate and understand Hamlet. We anticipate that gradually, over the next few or several years, students will achieve those certain thresholds of capacity, maturity, and emotional range to the point where teaching Hamlet becomes more viable. That sort of consistent, gradual change over time is a form of systematic variability. But it's also worth noting that that variability exists not only across time, but within a given group. So, for example, if you took a random group of 8th graders, you would not expect them all to be equally mature to one another. You would expect a predictable range of maturity within those students. Even if you took one individual 8th grade student, you would not expect him to be equally mature in all circumstances, in all situations. We recognize that certain circumstances will bring out the best in his maturity, in other situations, the worst. There are several levels of this kind of systematic variability. What other types of systematic variability do we already see widely in education? For example, some people might point to things like learning styles, and sometimes this is misunderstood. If we apply learning styles to individuals as if they are static and permanent, I think we've missed the point. Some students might display being visual learners, for example, in many circumstances, but that doesn't mean that they're visual learners all the time, and it certainly doesn't mean that they only learn through visual channels. Such a student might learn visually in some circumstances and auditorily in others, and really need to get their hands on an activity to understand in still other situations. Even then, I believe that many of these students would benefit from experiencing information in auditory, visual, and hands-on situations, regardless of which one is their best. Can you think of other examples, whereby variability exists within students themselves? You're beginning to get the picture, I think, that there is systematic variability that we already recognize. What I want to do is expand that into new types of systematic variability that research has led us to that have significant implications for how we teach design learning and design learning environments. Research says that new learning sciences and technologies have allowed us to determine that some forms of systematic variability occur at all ages in all learning environments. What we found is that there are hundreds of networks in the brain that govern learning, but when they're simplified and boiled down into larger networks, we come down to the most simple representation being 3 networks that affect learning. The first is called the recognition network. It deals with how we recognize and conceptualize information, and we know now that this is systematically variable. There's also a strategic network. This is concerned with how we plan, perform, and express ourselves. This is also systematically variable. Finally, we have the engagement networks. These are concerned with what motivates and sustains us through challenges. And you'll find different people are motivated and find sustenance with different things. Let's take a look at each. The recognition network is ultimately about incoming information. This is what's guiding us to how we perceive things, how we make sense of things, how we conceptualize ideas. That's all recognition network. Within this, there's several different aspects. I'm going to look at just a few. We note that there is systematic variability when it comes to how people prefer to perceive information. Let me give an example. For example, some people really love being able to listen to somebody talk, and others will prefer the captions or the subtitles, or perhaps a transcript that they can search through. Note that the transcript, for example, might originally be thought of as something that meets the needs of somebody with a disability. For example, somebody who has a hard time hearing my voice. But you'll find that if you have a transcript to search through using technology, you might be able to find keywords or concepts that you want to review later, instead of having to scroll through a video to figure out where did I hear that. And thus we have a good example here of what is necessary for some is good for everybody. So, differences in how we prefer to perceive are systematic. Then we have differences in what we need in terms of language, mathematical expressions, and symbols. So, for example, if a math teacher was trying to explain the concept of roots in a calculus class, some students would prefer to have this explained in common English. Other students would prefer to see the information presented in mathematical notation, and still others would really like to see it visually before they would understand. So, for example, if you look at mathisfun.com, they have a whole glossary of math terms that presents the same term in multiple ways, in common English, in mathematical notation, and as some sort of a graphic representation, as you see here. The combination of these three enhances the ability of different people to understand the concepts. Some people will prefer one or the other method of representation, but everybody ends up benefiting from seeing multiple representations of the same thing. Next, we see systematic variance in the way people take paths to comprehending ideas. So, for example, some people might really need to connect something to their prior learning before they comprehend it. Other people might really need a hands-on activity to apply it before they understand what they're talking about. And still others want to see how the different ideas that they're learning interrelate and would benefit from seeing things like flowcharts or other types of graphic organizers that represent ideas in connection with other ideas. These different paths to comprehension are systematically variable across the population. This is to say, if I'm going to meet the needs of a large group of students, I ought to be thinking about different ways that I can provide paths to comprehension so that multiple students can arrive there. Let's take a look at the next network, action and expression. This is, unlike the first one, about outgoing, how people express themselves, how they act out on what they're learning. This is how they're going to be successful or not successful on assessments, that sort of thing. For example, there is systematic variability in the way people express themselves. Some people will find their strong suit when they're in a situation in which they can dialogue in a crowd among other people, bouncing ideas off various people at various times and sharing different thoughts and questions and so forth in a large room of people. Me personally, I'm very social, but if you put me into a large party, I'm likely to be the one who's petting the dog in the corner. I would prefer, in most situations, being able to sit down one-on-one to talk to somebody in depth about complex ideas. For me, a classroom setting in which I have the opportunity to talk to somebody one-on-one is going to be more enriching than a mass conversation session that is so enlivening to some people. Still other students are going to struggle with both of those, that when you put them in a situation in which they have to dialogue orally with another person, they shut down. Maybe because of shyness, maybe because of desire to make sure that their English language is correct when it comes out. There could be a number of reasons, but sometimes those students are the ones who are the most active in text-based discussion boards. Hence, if we give our students options for how to express themselves, whether as dialogic with a large group or with an individual, or in non-oral forms, we're going to give different ways for people to express themselves because we recognize that those needs for expression are systematically variable. Another way that we see systematic variability in action and expression is the different methods that people use to manage executive functioning. Executive functioning covers things like goal setting, strategy development, managing information, monitoring progress, etc. So, for example, when we have a major assignment coming up in a course, some students really want to see the big assignment, the big picture. They want to know the forest, not the trees. Where are we going? And let me at it. Let me just kind of chip away at it in my own way with different perspectives until I get to the final product. Other students really need a step-by-step process to follow through because they become absolutely overwhelmed when they focus on the project as a whole. Then there are students who are neither of these binaries. They want to see the big picture and they want to see the tasks, and they want to go back and forth between them or in some sort of a hybrid of the two. That's systematically variable. Finally, let's look at engagement. With an engagement, there are many different ways students can be systematically variable. I'm going to look at two. They might have different paths to being interested. For example, in a chemistry class, you might have some students who love science, love chemistry, are super excited to be in the class simply because of the content being discussed. On the other hand, you might well have students who are only there because their advisor told them that they have to take this class, and they might not be interested in the topics at all. The way that the instructor engages these students is going to have to be different. It's going to have to be much more intentional to get the student who isn't interested in the topic engaged to the point where they can actually learn something. Then, you might have systematic variability in the way that people have needs for supports for persistence. In any class, it ought to get to a point where the learning is difficult, where the work is challenging. And when those points come, students need strategies, they need support for how they're going to persist. People are systematically variable in what works for them. Some people might find that when they have a peer support group in which they can have study groups, venting sessions, in which they can collaborate or cheer each other on, that really keeps them going. For others, it may be consistent reminders as to how the content will further their career ambitions, etc. The point is, when things get tough, not everybody can be sustained by the same things. There's systematic variability in how we find sustenance through challenge. These are just a few ways that those three brain networks demonstrate this concept of systematic variability as it pertains to teaching and learning. Just as important as understanding these three separate networks is the fact that they also overlap tremendously. The brain isn't three separate organs, it's one organ, and those networks are also networked with one another. You'll see this when we begin to find solutions for addressing that variability, sometimes by presenting information in multiple ways, which fits best with the recognition network. It increases engagement, and it increases the degree and the style in which students will respond. That's the overlap between the three networks. So, how does providing flexibility and options for representation, action and expression, and engagement help our diverse students learn? Let's explore this conceptually. Let's say hypothetically that an instructor decides to take this to heart and delivers a given lesson using multiple means of representation. In this case, oral lecture, but then also graphic representation during the lecture, and also ends in time to have in the hands-on activity in which students apply the content of the lecture. At the same time, students are encouraged during the lecture to take notes. Maybe they're given guided notes, maybe they're given an opportunity for shared notes, whatever. And then there's also opportunity for group discussion. So maybe the lecture will pause every 5 or 10 minutes or so at sensible points and allow the students to briefly dialogue about what the main points were, why they're relevant, how they want to think about them, what questions they have, etc., as a way to express themselves during the lecture. In terms of engagement, the professor is going to find ways to make sure that the activities of the day are actually given credit. So for some students, knowing that this is going to count towards the grade is very motivating. Other students might find that when the content is made relevant by the professor, that's what makes them interested and keeps them engaged in the lesson. Finally, some students might find that when we're doing that sort of group activity, when we have that sort of dialogue, that having a community, having people to bounce my confusion off of and share thoughts with and receive encouragement from, that's what engages them and that's what sustains them. Now note that not all of the students are going to find all of these eight different things interesting or important to them. Different students are going to take different aspects of the lesson as the main things that help them learn. So this particular student, for example, might find all of the non-traditional elements. That's what sustained them. That's what interested them. That's what helped them learn and understand and retain what they were being taught. On the other hand, you might have a student who fits more with, she really likes the traditional things, the oral lecture, the note-taking, the grade-based motivation. That's what sustained her. That's what helped her learn. And still another student is some sort of combination of these two. There's a lot of different ways that the students might use these 8 approaches, these 8 options that were given to find meaning, to find sustenance, to find learning in the process. So I showed you 3. But mathematically speaking, if we had just 8 discrete options with representation, expression, and engagement, assuming students draw at least one from each, there are 17 possible combinations. That's a lot of flexibility. It allows us to really span the range of students and their different interests and their different needs in a fairly efficient way. Now let's compare this to a traditional lecture. So we have one way of representing information, or a lecture. We have one way of acting or expressing, in this case, note-taking. And maybe we have a couple ways of engaging the students. We have grade-based motivators, and we hope that some of the students are interested in the content. In this case, we have a grand total of 3 combinations, but they are more like shades of the same combination. All students experience the oral lecture, all have the option to note-take, and some students will be motivated by grades, others by content, and some by both. That's it. It just isn't enough to cover the spectrum of the types of students we can expect in the classroom. So in summary, systematic variability is a model or established pattern that exhibits predictable results. Research has shown that there is a systematic variability within and among people of any age or grade, including in higher education. 3 key areas of variability are in brain networks for recognition, action and expression, and engagement. Being intentional about how we design flexibility in these domains can lead to more effective instruction for all.